August 15th, 1982, Washington State. A middle-aged man named Robert Ainsworth is rafting down the Green River when he sees something terrifying. Beneath the gloomy surface of the water, a pair of human eyes stare back at him. But the water is flowing and unclear, so unsure of what he's looking at, Ainsworth leans closer and sees a young woman's face. Believing it to be just a mannequin, he tries to snag it with a pole, but in the struggle, his raft capsizes and he's flung into the water. It is here, beneath the surface, that he discovers that this is no mannequin, this is the lifeless body of a woman, and she's not alone. Another corpse suddenly appears, suspended in the darkness behind her. Panicking, he claws his way out onto the riverbank, where he sits frozen in shock. But it's not until the police are called that they uncover something far darker than Ainsworth's chilling discovery, because there is a third body, dumped in a grassy area nearby. She'd been strangled to death with blue pants constricting her neck. There are bruises on her body, and it's clear a struggle took place. She is soon identified as 16-year-old Opal Mills. The two other victims from the river, Marcia Chapman and Cynthia Hines, died the same way, strangulation. But unlike Mills, their bodies were kept underwater by rocks, some of which were inserted inside their genitals. These three victims matched a similar pattern that was emerging in the Green River area: missing women, bodies found, and death by strangulation, all within 6 months. It is now clear that a serial killer is on the loose, one that is meticulous, persistent, and extremely dangerous. Police know they have to stop him soon, or more bodies will be found, but what they don't know is just how hard it's going to be to catch him. This is the story of the Green River Killer and the men and women who brought him to justice. Washington State is a mild, temperate, peaceful place, home to foggy winters and warm summers, with parts of it even being called the quietest in the US. But into this quiet, everyday peace had walked a serial killer, one that was extremely effective. To catch him, the police were going to need the best. Years earlier, an enormous task force was formed to stop Ted Bundy's notorious rampage. But for the Green River Killer, they went even bigger. Detective Dave Reicher and Major Richard Kraske led the team, alongside experienced help from FBI profiler John Douglas and Detective Bob Keppel, the man who helped catch Bundy. But their target, the Green River Killer, was still a mystery. They had bodies, but not much else, and they worried that it wouldn't be long before another life was claimed. Time was running out, so they had to move fast. Information from sources was pouring in from all over. Yet little of it was useful, and much of it was impossible to manage. However, one early lead proved promising. Many of the murder victims had a similar career history: prostitution. Some even knew of each other. This gave investigators an angle: find where the girls would frequent and investigate other prostitutes, and surely a lead would emerge. So they began with Seattle City, the bustling metropolis northeast of Green River, and an obvious place to start. At first though, local prostitutes were distrustful and reluctant to supply information, but eventually names did begin to leak their way into the detectives' nets, and a list of possible suspects emerged. On August 20th, 1982, police took one of them into custody. He'd allegedly referred to the Green River killings while raping a prostitute. A damning claim, but with no real evidence. He was soon released. Another lead referred to a man abducting prostitutes in a blue and white truck. One woman, Susan Widmark, was violently raped at gunpoint. Again, the assailant referred to the Green River killings, all while still aiming a gun at her head. But at a stoplight, Widmark escaped, and she even memorized part of the man's registration. A similar scene happened to 15-year-old Deborah Estes when she was hitchhiking. A man in a blue and white truck picked her up, held a gun to her head, sexually assaulted her, and then left her handcuffed in the woods. With these two accounts, the task force began searching for the distinctive truck. In September, they found it. Charles Clinton Clark was stopped by police in Seattle while driving his blue and white truck. Clark was a butcher by trade, but a background check revealed he owned firearms. When Estes and Widmark saw his photo, they identified him as the attacker. But although they saw justice, the Green River case was far from over because Clark had a solid alibi during the disappearances of the Green River's victims. So it couldn't have been him. To make matters worse, another victim had just vanished. This time it was Mary Bridget Meehan. She was 19 years old and 8 months pregnant. 2 weeks prior to Mary's disappearance, 2 16-year-olds also vanished. All were suspected victims of the Green River killer. Whoever he was still out there, and the police were no closer to catching him, nor did they have any idea of who he was. Not just in identity, but in personality. That had to change. So FBI profiler John Douglas began to put together a picture of the killer. He was likely to be middle-aged, impulsive, and confident. He would return to his murder scenes to reenact them in his mind, and he would know the area well. He might be deeply religious, he may be interested in criminology and detective work, he may have even contacted the police to help them. One taxi driver fit this description, so the police got to work. The driver was followed, monitored, and interrogated, and during his interrogation, it was discovered that he knew 5 of Green River Killer's victims. Bingo, the police now had a primary suspect, or so they thought. Despite these coincidences, there was no strong evidence linking him to the killings, and the man was released. So frustrations were growing, not just in the task force, but in the community. In late September, another victim's decomposing remains were found. 17-year-old prostitute Giselle A. Lavaughn. She had been strangled to death, and her body was left abandoned by SeaTac Airport. And over the next 6 months, a dozen more girls vanished. Many were young, many were prostitutes. But this time, one would present a clue. The last girl to go missing was Marie Malva. Witnesses who'd seen Malva the day she vanished had a startling story. She was seen soliciting a man in a dark truck when they got into an argument. Her boyfriend said he saw her get inside the truck before its engines roared and the truck raced away. Although the boyfriend followed in pursuit, he lost them at a stoplight, and Marie was never seen again. But who was the man driving? Well, police received the lead that the truck's owner lived on South 348th Street. But when they spoke to him, an unassuming man named Gary Ridgway, nothing came of it. Ridgway denied ever seeing Malva, and the police dropped the lead. Shockingly, his truck was involved in the disappearance of another prostitute, Kimmy Kai Pitzer. Like Malva, she got into Ridgway's truck and was never seen again. But also like Malva, the police didn't pursue this lead any further. If only they had. By now, the investigation was losing steam. There were no fresh leads and disappearances were rapidly increasing. Whoever the Green River Killer was, he was winning. And the largest investigation in the history of the country was being outsmarted by one man. It was clear that a new strategy was needed. Bob Keppel, one of the detectives involved, proposed a $2 million overhaul of the investigation. His proposal was built around better data management. He hoped that better organization would help reinvigorate the case.
We keep finding more and more every day. You get in that woods and you just don't know what's in there. It's so thick.
And it needed to, because throughout the rest of 1983, dozens more young women would vanish and more bodies would be found. One woman, Carol Ann Christensen, had her body displayed in an incredibly disturbing way. Her head was covered with a paper bag, fish were placed on her body and between her legs, and ground beef was left in her hand. Like the others, she was strangled to death. In 1984, Bob Keppel's advice was implemented. Spearheaded by the task force's new leader, Captain Frank Adamson, information was organized and teams were more effectively structured, with one for victims and one for suspects. Keppel also overhauled the approach to suspects. Ingeniously, he advised that investigators focus not on their guilt, but rather their possible innocence. He reasoned that this would remove people with solid alibis more efficiently and allow investigators to track ones without. But throughout this time, the killings continued, and 9 new bodies were found in back roads or dumping areas. To FBI profiler John Douglas, it was clear that the killer viewed his victims as garbage.
For a long time, people in the Seattle area and elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest have had a string of unsolved murders on their minds. They're called the Green River murders. Well, now, 2 prisoners in a San Francisco jail have said they killed some of the victims, who were all women. But David Burrington reports that for now, Seattle police are skeptical.
Now almost 3 years have passed. The murders haven't stopped and the police have nothing to go on. The little progress they've made has become embarrassing, and in August, 2 criminals actually confessed to the killing, but it was revealed to be a hoax. The task force had reached a dead end. They desperately needed a fresh approach. And they'd get it, but from the most unlikely, unexpected, and terrifying ally imaginable. Ted Bundy, the prolific and famous serial killer who confessed to the murders of 30 women, a man described by his own defense as the very definition of heartless evil.
I'll plead not guilty right now, and your grand jury.
Bob Keppel received word that Bundy was willing to assist the Green River Killer investigation. But at this time, Bundy was on death row, and his motives for helping were unclear. But for Keppel, the invitation was irresistible, not just for its value in catching Green River, but also for its insight into the mind of a serial killer. Soon the pair exchanged letters, and Bundy's perspective was invaluable. He thought the killer would know his victims personally. He'd likely befriend them to lower their guard. Bundy suggested more bodies would be found near previous dump sites. He also thought the bodies would be near where the killer lived. After a while, Bundy became a key consultant on the case. Although you've got to wonder why you would take advice from a man who lied for decades against overwhelming evidence. He's not exactly the most reliable of sources. But even with his help, the Green River Killer's identity remained a mystery, and new bodies were being discovered, and the task force was bewildered. John Douglas even thought there might be 2 killers rather than 1. His reasoning was that not all of the bodies were disposed the same way, an idea that would return later in the case, but for now, the task force's lack of results had become widely known and widely denounced. The public was afraid, desperate and angry. They wanted someone to blame. The media began calling the task force a joke, all the while more bodies were being discovered, worsening the public sentiment. And towards the end of 1986, this fall in reputation bore fruit. The task force staffing fell by 40% and Captain Frank Adamson was replaced. A new captain, James Pompey, was in charge, but instead of a fresh start, he immediately encountered a wild card. New bodies appeared, except this time they were further north in British Columbia. Alongside these bodies were the remains of other women. To detectives, this felt like the Green River Killer. But why so far north? Perhaps he was playing with them. In early 1987, the task force had caught another suspect. This time, one they'd already questioned, Gary Ridgway, the man in the dark truck who had been involved in the disappearances of 2 women. Ridgway was highly suspicious, with a history of soliciting prostitutes as well as getting into conflict with them. But when he passed the lie detector with flying colors, it seemed as though he was the wrong man, at least until Detective Matt Haney discovered some damning evidence. In 1982, Ridgway had been questioned by police, all while having a passenger inside his truck. That passenger was Kelly McGinnis, one of the Green River victims. Furthermore, Haney discovered 2 more pieces of evidence. Ridgway was often seen at dump sites where the victims had been found, and he'd been off work every time a Green River Killer victim had vanished. Pretty damning, right? Well, Ridgway's home was searched and bodily samples were taken, but even with all of this evidence and all the connections to the case, apparently there wasn't enough to arrest him, and Gary was released. And if that sounds ridiculous, the fact they let him off with all of that evidence, it gets even worse. Remember the new captain, James Pompey? Well, a few weeks after Ridgway's release, he was scuba diving when he died of a heart attack. Not only a tragedy for the man and his family, but another disaster for the task force. Captain Pompey's death turned into a media frenzy, with some even stating his death was an inside job committed by the Green River Killer himself. Soon, even more bodies appeared. Cindy Ann Smith, Debbie Gonzalez, and Deborah Estes. The situation was getting desperate, and the task force desperately needed a suspect. Eventually, they found one. Petty thief and prison escapee William J. Stevens. Stevens was an antisocial individual who hated women and prostitutes and often spoke about murdering them. And when police searched his house, they found guns, police badges, fraudulent credit card receipts from the years of the Green River killings, and he even had another house in Portland, south of Seattle. This house, in particular, was rather ominous. It contained a secret room. You know the type in movies where a book is pulled from a shelf to reveal a hidden door? Well, inside this room was a bed, and atop lay a mannequin dressed in women's lingerie. William Stevens even once showed this room to a neighbor. Can you imagine if the bloke next door just pops over one day, knocks on your door and says, "Hey, do you fancy coming over and checking out my secret murder sex dungeon, complete with creepy mannequin?" I'm a curious guy. Admittedly, I'd probably take a look, but after that, I'm selling my house and getting the hell out of there. And Stevens was a weird guy and an obvious pick for Green River, but his brother provided an alibi for him. Apparently, he was in Connecticut when the killings occurred, and his brother could back this up with evidence. Stevens was cleared. He was not the Green River killer. Interestingly, years later, the same brother who provided that alibi came to believe that William was in fact the Green River killer, or at least involved somehow. His reasoning was that his brother's stay in Connecticut had been less permanent than he thought. But whatever the truth is, William Stevens and his creepy mannequin remain a mystery to this day. By now, it was July 1991. More bodies had been found in recent years, but the task force was no closer to discovering the culprit. It seemed like the killer had won. The task force was beaten, and no justice would be delivered to his victims. 9 years the task force had been operating, to the tune of millions of dollars. The Green River killer had supposedly killed 49 victims and completely gone away with it. The task force were defeated. And not even star FBI profilers, crack detectives, or Ted Bundy himself had managed to catch the killer. It was now the largest unsolved murder case in the nation's history. And it would remain that way for 10 years, dormant and forgotten.
The hardest thing to come to grips with for a lot of us is that this could have occurred here in our community for such a period of time. And as we sit here, that person responsible is yet to be brought to justice.
Until one enormous breakthrough. In 2001, Dave Reichert, one of the first men on the original task force, was the sheriff of King County. Life had moved on, but he hadn't. The case of the Green River killer stayed in his mind, and now 20 years on, he had new technology to solve it. Good old forensics, specifically DNA testing. So Reichert formed a new task force of experts who combed through the evidence and compared DNA samples from suspects and victims. And just like that, there was a match. DNA evidence confirmed that Gary Ridgway was the Green River killer. And after 20 years of investigation, countless obstacles, embarrassments, failures, and setbacks, the men and women of the task force had finally brought him to justice.
Gary Leon Ridgway, now in custody, was a prime suspect back then, but police didn't have enough evidence to make a solid case. But in 1987, Ridgway was asked to chew on a piece of gauze, leaving his saliva and, more importantly, a DNA sample with police, who held on to it. Even though DNA technology hadn't reached maturity yet, police believed it was only a matter of time.
Over 5 months, Ridgway confessed to 48 murders and presented a strange psychological profile. At school, his IQ had tested in the low 80s, 20 points below the average. This would imply stupidity, but in his killings, he was meticulous. More so than any killer. He never kept trophies, threw away victims' jewelry, wore gloves, changed his tires to prevent them being tracked, and chose, it pains me to say this, necrophilia over rape because it was less risky. And he did all of that while winning awards for his attendance at his day job. And although he didn't collect trophies, he certainly took pleasure in what he did. When referring to throwing away his victims' jewelry, he said he liked the idea of someone finding it and walking around in it, not knowing the dark truth of where it came from. Forensic psychologists like Reed Malloy noted that Ridgway had incredible containment. He took huge pride in his killings, but never communicated this to anyone. a remarkable feat of discipline. Ridgway also channeled his sexual homicidal aggression. It didn't spill over into any other crimes. In contrast, if you remember the case of Yu Young Chul, the raincoat killer, which we just covered, Yu couldn't resist his violent urges, and they would spill over with random attacks of violence on innocent people. This lack of restraint contributed to his eventual demise. But Gary, he focused it on one avenue. He choked women to death, and in his words, "I was pretty good at it." Ridgway was cold and heartless. He told investigators he was missing something fundamental that other people had: caring. He said the faces of his victims meant nothing to him. In 1982, he even killed one victim while his 7-year-old son rode with him. He told his son that she walked home. Later, he claimed he felt a bit of remorse about that. So who really was Gary Ridgway, and what made him who he was? The best answer I've found comes from Bob Keppel. He said, "It's not just a matter of the chemistry of parental abuse or head injuries. What it really comes down to is choice. Ridgway chose to kill, and he made that choice because he wanted to."
I plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 45 for the death of Cindy A. Smith.
Guilty.
46 for the death of Patricia M. Barzak.
Guilty.
For the death of Patricia Yellowrobe.
Guilty.
For the death of an unidentified person known as Jane Doe B20.
Guilty.
In the end, he was convicted of 49 murders with suspicions that he killed over 90 people. He was spared the death penalty as part of a plea bargain, and he is imprisoned at Washington State Penitentiary with no hope of parole.